Everywhere we turn, it seems there's someone trying to limit our speech. On college campuses and mainstream and social media, sometimes censorship prevails. Our speech is labeled homophobic, Islamophobic, divisive, and offensive. Nearly three-quarters of Americans polled say political correctness is silencing discussion about important societal matters. And more than half say they're afraid to share their views. Nadine Strossen is professor of constitutional law at New York Law School, the first woman national president of the American Civil Liberties Union, where she served from 1991 through 2008. Her new book is out next month. It's called Hate: Why We Should Resist It with Free Speech, Not Censorship. So, Nadine, thank you for joining us today. Social media is being turned into an emotional wound for many people. What do you think?
Gary, first of all, thank you so much for having me on. And this should be an issue that is of special concern to your audience members because, sadly, among the expression that is demonized as so-called hate speech, and I will explain in a moment why I put air quotes around that term, religious speech, especially traditional Christian beliefs, have repeatedly been assailed as allegedly expressing hateful views against certain groups of people. But the term has no agreed upon legal meaning. The Supreme Court has never identified and defined a category of speech based on its message and said that message is so hateful or hated that it is not going to be constitutionally protected. To the contrary, the Supreme Court has famously, across the vast ideological spectrum of justices, agreed that the bedrock of our free speech jurisprudence is what the court calls viewpoint neutrality, that regardless of the viewpoint, even if it might be considered hateful and even if it is hated, that is never a justification for suppressing it.
Well, I know that a recent poll showed that some college students are fearful that they're losing their speech rights on campus. But then in turn, they also showed, well, maybe we should limit hate speech. Why do you think they're thinking that way these days?
Well, and I do have to say I'm very disturbed by those polls, Gary, but I don't want to unfairly single out college students or today's college students, because in truth, anytime you take a poll of any segment of the public, there is dismayingly lack of understanding about basic free speech principles. And in particular, everybody thinks that it's just common sense that if they hate a particular idea, that's the one idea that should be subject to censorship, right? So many years ago, a wonderful journalist named Nat Hentoff wrote a book whose title says it very well: Freedom of Speech for Me, but not for thee, how the left and right in America relentlessly censor each other.
Well, I know as a distinguished law professor, I'm sure you have some insights on the best way to educate people about free speech, expressing themselves without crossing too many lines. So what approach do we need to embrace?
Well, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity, because that is exactly why I wrote the book, and in the hope that I would have the chance to speak to people such as you and members of your audience to persuade people that no matter who we are and no matter what we believe, we depend on a robust freedom of speech in order not only to be able to discuss and present our own ideas, but also in order to be able to advocate for causes or organizations that we believe are important, in order to participate effectively as citizens in a democratic country. After all, so many of the topics and ideas that have been demonized and sought to be suppressed as so-called hate speech are at the core of very important public policy issues. One person's hate speech is somebody else's cherished, loving speech, right? We are such a wonderfully diverse society with many different views and values about what is right and true and good and just. So not surprisingly, we can't possibly arrive at a consensus, nor should we arrive at a consensus about what ideas are sufficiently hated or hateful that they should be suppressed. That decision should not be up to a majority. One case that sadly all too typical, a California high school treated as hate speech that could be punished a T-shirt that a student wore to school, quoting a Bible verse, the thrust of which I'm sure you know the verse that homosexuality is sinful. Now, he was a devout Christian. He obviously believed that trying to persuade individuals not to engage in same-sex sexual conduct would save their souls. I don't accept that belief myself. I'm not a Christian, but I certainly defend his right to hold that belief and to express that belief. And I would certainly never describe his sharing that belief as hateful. It was the opposite.
Now, many governments around the world censor news and speech. They say it works well. Like China says, other nations should follow their lead on internet censorship. What do you think about that? Should the United States follow the Chinese example?
Absolutely not. And that's why there are so many people who are leaving China or trying to leave China for the United States, also while they are still in China, trying their best to thwart the government's censorial efforts. And this is especially important for anybody who challenges the status quo. It's completely incompatible with the concept of democracy. That is the basis on which this country was founded. Now, the internet is such an interesting example, Gary, because lately we've been hearing a lot of complaints, well-justified complaints, about unfortunate kinds of expression for which the internet is being used, manipulating American elections, hate speech, fake news, and so forth. But I continue to believe what the Supreme Court has said since the mid-20th century, that the best response to speech that we dislike or find to be dangerous for any reason is not censorship, but more speech. Expose the lies, give true information, allow people to refute hate mongers, to support those that they disparage, and certainly strongly enforce laws that criminalize any actual discriminatory conduct and violence, but do not outlaw ideas. It just doesn't work.